Okay, so I think we should get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Chmaika Mills, and I'm the Vice President of UMBA. Welcome to our town hall, the State of Black America and What's Next. Just to let you know, this is a recorded event. 2020 has been a remarkable year thus far with heightened awareness of racial and health issues. And I'm sure we've all taken part in recent discussions about the history and current standing of Black Americans. And many of us have probably wondered, where do we go from here? So we hope that today's panel helps address some of those questions. Many of you submitted questions for the panel during registration. Thank you for those. I'm sure other questions and comments will come up during the town hall. So please feel free to submit any questions using the chat feature. We will try to address as many as possible. Our moderator for today's panel is Adia Moore. Adia Moore graduated from the University of Maryland in 2003 with a BA in Government and Politics. She went on to Louisiana State University for law school, but she is always a Terp for life. She now practices at the law offices of Darlene Wakefield, where she is a child advocate in child welfare cases with the Department of Social Services in Maryland. Ms. Moore continues to stay active in her community through various local organizations. So Ms. Moore, I will turn it over to you at this time.
Thank you, Chmaika, and thank you for having me today. Let's get this started. So I am going to introduce our panelists today, starting with ladies first. We have Dr. Amana Ali Carter. Dr. Carter graduated in 2003 from UMD with a BS double majored in psychology and criminal justice. She was a special education teacher, then pursued her PhD at Howard University in 2015. She completed a 2-year fellowship in rehabilitation psychology at Johns Hopkins University. Currently, she is attending psychologist on the spinal cord injury unit at MedStar Nationalist Rehabilitation Hospital. Dr. Ali Carter is also Director of Training for Rehabilitation and Pain Psychology Postdoctoral Fellowship and was appointed co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of MedStar National Rehabilitation Network. Dr. Ali Carter is an adjunct professor in cross-cultural psychology at Bowie State University. Her research interests have focused on health disparities among persons from the African diaspora. She has several symposium presentations, peer-reviewed publications, and a book chapter on psychological and social factors that contribute to disparate health outcomes. Thank you for joining us today. Our other panelist is Delegate Jazz Lewis. He is a longtime resident of Prince George's County, Maryland, and lives in the city of Glen Arden with his wife, Erin. Jazz is an alumnus of the University of Maryland, graduating in 2011 with a bachelor's in government and politics, in 2014 with a master's of public policy. Jazz began his career as a community organizer in Baltimore, which taught him that quality jobs, which pay living wages, change communities. Jazz is focused on criminal justice reform and economic opportunity to ensure our justice system is fair and that all citizens share in the growth of our economy. Jazz has successfully passed legislation to ban solitary confinement for juveniles, institute policy and prison accountability measures, and expand racial wealth equity. He currently works as a senior policy advisor for Majority Leader Congressman Steny Hoyer, tracking issues of criminal justice, small and minority business concerns, housing, and transit matters. Previously, he served as executive director of Hoyer's Maryland political organization. Jazz's core philosophy is that organized and active communities produce better outcomes for their children's education, their local economies, and their public safety. Jazz represents Maryland's 24th legislative district, currently serves on the House Judiciary Committee as chair of the Family Law Subcommittee, and is the chair of the Maryland House Democratic Caucus. Thank you for joining us today, Jazz. Okay, let's get started. Do you both have opening words that you'd like to share with our group? Let's start with Jazz.
Sure. Thank you, Chmaika and Adia and Cassie and the entire board for having me on today. I'm a former member of the UMBA board. I enjoyed my time there. So, it's nice to see everyone again. I think it's apt for us to have a conversation with the Black alumni at this time, with right now that everything that's going on nationally, be it from the pandemic, be it from the uprisings from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, the changes we've seen on our university from, students getting injured, everyday visitors getting injured, and having our second Black president in President Darrell Pines. And I'm still getting used to saying that instead of Dean Pines. It's a good thing. I'm hoping that in this conversation, we can cover as many topics as possible, be it from criminal justice reform, which is a huge topic right now. And it seems like for once, public opinion is on our side. Just a few years ago, when Michael Brown was murdered, nationally, only about 40% of Americans thought that we had an issue with police brutality and the like. And has recently been polled by University of Washington and Washington Post and things like that. Over 67% of Americans believe that there's an issue with how police interact with Black communities. That extends not just in the beginning side of the criminal justice system, all the way through how you're in prisons and who's in our prisons. 70% of Maryland's prison population is Black, despite that we only make 30% of the state. When we look at those who are getting paroled, they disproportionately are not Black. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot to change. I hope we can also talk about racial wealth and opportunity. Right now, we've seen that from the federal PPP loans and other things that have been granted, disproportionately has been larger companies that have benefited from these government bailouts, and not smaller companies that tend to be woman-owned, tend to be minority-owned and the like. And what are going to be the collateral consequences for our community for that? We've seen the stats on the national unemployment rate has gone from about 3% to 11%. And what's trailing that is, what is the unemployment rate specifically in our communities and how long is it going to take for us to recover? And of course, we also know that Corona and the pandemic has disproportionately affected our communities, right? Black communities in particular has been hit hard in New York, here in Maryland, places like Chicago and Detroit have been hurt hard. But also our Latino brothers and sisters, we're seeing in the Southwest are surging. In Maryland, the zip code that has been hit the single most is the zip code surrounding Langley Park, and we know that this has happened because our folks, Black and brown folks tend to be in the professions that cause them to interact with more people. That makes it hard for you to social distance and the like. And I think that's actually connected to the conversations on racial wealth and some of these other things too, on why it seems that we can never bridge this gap of opportunity and resources. So, I'm excited. I started my journey into politics and policy on Maryland's campus. I went to Maryland's campus originally thinking that I was going to be an architect. And after we were all excited after President Obama was elected, woohoo, the recession followed. And the way it affected me and a lot of my friends was that the state of Maryland saw massive revenue loss because people were losing their homes, and our state's disproportionately funded by property tax revenue as well as income tax revenue and sales tax revenue. And as those things went down and they had to balance the books, they decided that, well, going to college is a privilege, not an entitlement. So they proposed raising tuition about 20% would have priced me out. I worked 3 jobs while I was in undergrad to help pay through. I had a Pell Grant that took care of half. And I worked at the Quality Inn Hotel in College Park, which is now gone. I worked at the U.S. Coast Guard, and I played my guitar at local churches and things like that. And the idea that I would be priced out of my education when I did nothing wrong made me upset. So me and a bunch of students organized, had a town hall at Nimbaru, filled about 600 people in a 300 space room. So it reminded me of a courtyard sweat party. And we decided what we're going to do. We organized, and the next day we all descended, about 1,000 students, on President Moat's office at the time. And I quickly got pushed into his office to negotiate what it would take for us to stand down. And that taught me about people power. And I think that's what we're seeing in these streets now. And I got started in this journey then. I didn't think I would end up elected here and now and working on the issues that I'm working on. But I'm proud that God has given me this opportunity to serve now and in this time and in this moment. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Delegate Lewis. Dr. Ali Carter, do you have a few words you'd like to start with?
I do. Thanks for having me on the panel. And come on, courtyard sweat party. That brought back some memories. And you know, I didn't talk to Delegate Jazz before this, but he alluded to a lot of things that I wanted to bring up in my opening remarks. And that's really how the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, criminal justice reform are related. I hope with these opening remarks, I really want to broad folks' conceptualization of health in the Black community. And so I will say, I do think it was inevitable and not ironic that the COVID-19 pandemic and the George Floyd death and Breonna Taylor and the Black Lives Matter movement really interfaced, because they are indeed related. And whether it's Black lives being taken unjustifiably at the hands of the police, or whether it's health conditions and viruses that are ravaging the Black community, we are dying. So to further understand how these events are coupled, I wanted to start off with some semantics. In the media, I've been studying health disparities since 2008. And so it is really, it really gives me some hopefulness that there's so much discussion in the mainstream media about health disparities. But that word is a bit misleading to me, because this is what I study. So that most people are familiar with the term health disparities, and that's exactly what it means. It's a face valid word. It means health differences. And so what really came to light is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are contracting and dying at unequal rates from the COVID-19 virus compared to whites. So Black Americans are 5 times more likely compared to whites to be hospitalized for COVID-19 virus. And you know, if you are indeed being hospitalized and in the critical care unit, and your survivorship is going to be pretty rough. I mean, we're seeing residual cognitive impairments, mental health impairments. And again, the research is in its infant stages because this is new, but we can anticipate that the Black Americans and people of color who are recovering from COVID are going to have a very difficult road ahead for some of the structural barriers and systemic barriers that Delegate Jazz alluded to. So instead of health disparities, I think it's, you know, the word health disparities, it acknowledges that there are differences. But we must be aware that just differences and saying health disparities, that kind of sanitizes the unique experiences and lived experiences of African Americans in this country. And so I just want to encourage people to be thinking about these differences as health inequities. So health inequities suggest differences in health that are rooted in systemic racism and historic oppression. Okay. And this is important because this is the core connection. This is the piece that threads the Black Lives Matter movement and criminal justice reform and the current state of our health together. And so I was hoping to share a few examples of the byproducts of systemic racism and how these byproducts tie in together these two events that are in our face, the year 2020. And let me be clear, you know, health disparities have predated this conversation. They are longstanding, they are enduring, but again, it's never too late to begin to have this discussion. So there's a fear of criminal institutionalization, right, with the criminal justice system. And this same fear is inherent in mental health and medical treatment in the Black community. This fear prevents us from relying on systems that will ideally protect us, that were created to serve us. So we don't call on the police because of this fear. For the same reason, people in the community are not going to the hospital, not seeking out mental health treatment because of fear of psychiatric hospitalization or some other horrible consequences or ramifications. A byproduct of this, again, is mistrust. So mistrust in the criminal justice system and mistrust in the medical system. And mistrust has been associated with decreased utilization of preventative services, treatment engagement, treatment adherence in our community. And so when we talk about just generally these underlying medical health conditions, you hear them, really pointing to that to be the reason of disparities. That's just the surface. That's not the core. So I want to make that clear. And this mistrust that we have, the same way that it's alive with regard to criminal justice concepts and concerns, it's justified in the medical system. I mean, we have a history of medical errors, history of discrimination, malintent, and malpractice that has all been attached to just our race of being Black. So there's a similarity there that draws these two together. The other thing that I want to recognize, again, I want to refer you back to the core here, which is systemic racism. Systemic racism is reflected in policies and practices such as the history of redlining, right? And this has prevented social upward mobility and has promoted housing segregation. And so this has been associated with concentrated crime rates, right, and police targets. So this is a lot of discussion that's been sort of elucidated with the Black Lives Matter movement. But this same issue, the systemic racism, these policies that have created housing segregation, this is also concentrated health risks, right? So Black residents are more likely to be exposed to lead, have limited access to clean water, fresh vegetables and fruits. And this is by design. These are based on legal practices and policies that are going to perpetuate poor health, right? And this is starting to be talked about. But again, if you broadly Google, how come African Americans are more at risk? You hear chronic underlying medical conditions, but why? Why, right? So this takes it a step further. The practices that create the achievement gaps, if you're in education, you hear that a lot. The unequal allocation of resources and work opportunities in the Black community. These are the same fruits that perpetuate things such as poor health literacy that are definitely relevant to why our community is disproportionately affected by some cancers and cardiovascular disease and disability, right? Low health literacy has been associated consistently with lack of knowledge about medical conditions, lack of engagement with healthcare providers, decreased comprehension of medical information, nutrition labels, higher rates of mortality, poor engagement in preventative services. This stuff is feeding the underlying medical conditions. And like Delegate Jazz spoke to, this achievement gap is why we see people of color in essential jobs and blue collar work creating a greater risk of COVID-19 spreading, a contraction and residual negative health effects. So I know I can ramble, so Adia, just, wrap me up if I go on too long, but I just want to end by being clear that the data that I'm presenting, I want to be clear that it doesn't suggest that people within the Black community or people of color or indigenous people are inherently paranoid or deficient or fragile. In fact, the Human Genome Project, what that demonstrates is that humans are more similar than they are different. And so with that in mind, I really want us to start thinking about health inequities, not only from the individual level, right? Because, you hear, oh gosh, the surgeon generals and all the medical professionals and media coverage making recommendations like eat healthy and just exercise. And so that can create blame and stigma. So I want to sort of shape this conversation by moving away from that. And yes, there should be individual accountability, but we must think about this from a systemic racism standpoint. We must look at this through a socio-historical lens. This is how we start the conversation and keep the conversation about solutions relevant, feasible, and, you know, to give us the products that we're looking for. So I will end my opening remarks with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mana. I think to continue with that, you did talk about health inequities. And one of the questions that we had was actually related to how do we reduce bias within the health system? You talked about that it's there, that there are healthy inequities. So I guess this question is for both of you, from both of your backgrounds. How do you suggest that we change the system, the health system from your backgrounds? And either one of you can start. Or one of you.
Okay, I'll hop in first, and I'll take a policy perspective as a legislator and respond from that perspective. So one of the things that we've seen that has changed as we have elected more folks of color across the nation, be them, African American, Latino, Asian descendant, indigenous, et cetera, is we start to bring forward legislation that benefit all people, right? And one of these in particular is minority maternal health as an example. Delegate Janelle Wilkins from Montgomery County and Delegate Jocelyn P. Melnick from Prince George's County have led a review of like, why are Black women dying in giving birth, right? Or why are our children being born low birth weight and other things like this? Because we just weren't studying it. Like the government wasn't making a priority to fund it. So then as policies work its way into the different various institutions, that's not a priority, right? So if you're not measuring it, if you're not reviewing these things, then you can't improve on them to begin with. And, so just generally something we started to do from a policy perspective is make sure we take an equity look on every new initiative that people bring forward, right? To see like, how will this affect underserved communities, minority communities, low income rural communities, to make sure that they're getting a due justice and the like. And that's one thing we're doing to try to improve the conversation and bringing new voices to the table from a policy perspective, albeit that's different than a ground actor who is, day-to-day seeing clients and things like that. But I'll stop there, and hopefully the doctor can add on from her perspective.
Thank you. So I was a researcher. I did most of my research at Howard University. And so to just dovetail what you were saying, it becomes it's complicated, right? Because researchers want funding. And researchers who look like us and researchers who are interested in health inequities and serving vulnerable communities, we have to write grants. We have to write research proposals to these big institutions that have dollars to support us. Now, what becomes tricky is that we have to make an argument for why our research is important. There's a panel of reviewers, they look at your proposal, they throw it out, they say this is worth it, they give you money. I'm simplifying the process a little bit, but just bear with me. If I'm on the writing end as a researcher, and I know there are not people at the table who care about what I'm researching, that may begin to shape and change and mold my research interests and sort of sanitize my initial mission. So if I'm interested in, let's say, health disparities and minorities in particular, I'll use the example that you give, why African-American women are having babies disproportionately at lower birth rates. If no one on the panel cares about that, if no one that's reviewing my research cares about that, I may say, well, I might just do something different. So then there becomes a deficit in the literature and the scientific community because dollars speak. researchers are getting funded. Researchers pay their salaries off money. So it really does take a courage and a boldness and a persistence and a perseverance to study some of these things. Again, I am hopeful because this is in the media now. There's so much more attention on health inequities that there are going to be dollars that are directed to disenfranchised communities, but it is just so complex. And this goes back to the systemic issue. We need people that look like us reviewing these research grants. We need people like us at the table. So yes, so what, just to circle back around, I do encourage people to get involved in research. We need, like Delegate Jazz was saying, we need people who are seeing and writing and researching just as much as we need people with boots on the ground, right? You have to have a blueprint before you have a construction team that can execute it. And so, getting people involved in research and people that look like us in research. I'll give an example. I conducted research at Howard University, okay? It took us 2 weeks to get research participants, African Americans. I conducted a similar study at NIH. It took months because people who look like us don't trust us, don't trust NIH. So if we can begin to infiltrate these systems, these organizations that have to, that review research and review these concerns, if people at the table that look like us, we will have, I think, more attention and more resources directed to the problem. That was long. The other things that we can do at the system level, as a psychologist, because I am boots on the ground, I work with people day in and day out who feel overwhelmed and discouraged and guilty about their capacity to make change, particularly in the era of social media. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement. If you were boots on the ground, protesting, advocating with signs, that can bring on a shame and a guilt. And so I just want to encourage people when they think about making change to think about it flexibly. What is your sphere that you can influence? What is in your reach? Is that going to just your neighbor's house and having a discussion with them? It might not look like what you think about in mainstream media and what you see on social media. So I just really would encourage people to be creative about how they're conceptualizing making change, if that makes sense.
So that was a great segue into another question that we have. Thank you for that. Many people have asked, and this is included with people that I know, they want to be more active, considering the climate that we have. And honestly, this comes about year after year. Stuff happens, like with George Floyd or with other people, and they say, how can I be more active? What can I do to affect change? And they don't know what to do. What suggestions do you have to affect change at a community level? And this goes to either one of you.
I can start. Again, I believe I would say my approach as a psychologist is I'm very humanist. So I believe that people have strengths and abilities and they're the experts on themselves. So I always get sort of stuck in my tracks when people say, well, what can I do? So I would encourage people to first do a self-inventory of what their strengths are, what their resources are, what their abilities are, what their emotional capacity is, what their financial situation is, right? What their home situation is. So just take an inventory of what you have to offer, your strengths and your abilities. And from there, I think that's where the plan develops, not from me saying, and Delegate Jazz, don't get me, but I can't always tell everyone, hey, write a letter to your, your state government, right? Make a phone call. That is a really difficult process for some people to navigate. It really is. And so I just encourage people to take a self-inventory and be creative and start where their strengths are. So if you are a great, I'm not making this up, if you are a great cook, for example, think about how that particular strength of yours can go to affect community change. Maybe it's sending baskets that you make to your neighbors who are able to make phone calls and do some of the other heavy work. So yeah, just going back to thinking flexibly and creatively with how you can be a mover and shaker.
So I actually agree with Dr. Carter holistically. Like I like to approach questions like this from my time as like a community organizer. And like, to be honest, like, you can only ask people to do what is within their bandwidth to do. And I mean that what they can do comfortably, the actionable, that can also lead them to potentially do more as they build their confidence, and that may be, getting active with your HOA or, just getting to know your neighbors, right? Because like, if you're concerned about, your community, how safe it is, how connected it is, you're concerned about your kids. Well, if you get to know the folks in your block, and y'all all know each other now, you have the safe haven here. And from there, then maybe you can take that and grow outward. And that's important. Marching and everything is important, but it's a privilege to be able to go out and march. It's a huge privilege. Not everyone can do that. Not just because of fear of getting tear gas or something else. Like, if you are a single parent and, you got a kid who's relying on you, you can't risk getting arrested, that's valid. There's no shame there. I do, however, think everyone has a duty to do something. Wherever that is for you. Calling a legislator can be intimidating. I know that even as a legislator, sometimes leading on issues that are not popular among my colleagues that deal with justice for our people, particularly on criminal justice reform, it is not easy. And I have to go back to, like, I like to call them like, the grandmas of the block to like build me up before I go on my next fight, because it can be tough. There are a bunch of groups people can get active with as well, where you can kind of be among a collective of people that can make this feeling less daunting. From PTAs, to more established groups like the NAACP, ACLU, and things like that. But my main thing is, I think we all have a duty to each other as a community to do something. Nothing's going to get better if we advocate our duties as citizens to take care of one another. But what that looks like for you, only and that's my response to that.
Sticking with you, Delegate Lewis, you mentioned criminal justice reform, which I know, reading your bio, that you've done a lot with. A heavily discussed topic recently is police reform. And can you tell us, what do you think is more effective for police reform legislation? Trying to change it on the local level or a state level, or even a national level, if you feel comfortable talking about it?
So I actually think it's most effective on the state level because most of the rules that govern policing and their guidelines, hiring practices, accountability is set at the state level with local union contracts for labor and whatnot, adding on to that. So if you have a strong base, then it can only get better at the local level, right? And so at first I would say at the state level. I think the other thing is important to know that like we have to be a bit strategic in our messaging and back one another up, you know. So I'm just go ahead and say this whole like, you know, defund the police thing. You know, folks have a gut reaction when they hear that, because they hear defund the police, and in their mind, you know, what processes is, oh, you're abolishing the police force. And if folks want to abolish the police force, they're going to say abolish the police force, right? What they mean when they say things like defund the police, they mean more accountability on police departments, police officers, and the like. They mean more community oversight of these bodies. They mean, you know, reinvesting some of the resources that's going to police into other human services that we want. You know, if someone calls you because someone calls 911 because someone's drunk in their car, you know, do you necessarily need to call 911? Right? Do you need to call does a police officer who's trained to control an environment need to be the first on that scene? We don't necessarily know. I'm not automatically saying no. Like, you don't know if that person could be dangerous or not, right? But maybe we need to pair that person with a health professional who can then go assess the situation. And then if the situation is outside the purview of what that health professional can do, then they have some protection of knowing that the law enforcement is also there to back them up, as opposed to only law enforcement being present. We need to have these conversations, and that's what they, that's what they mean. In Maryland, in particular, at the state level, where we have a work group focused on these issues, and one of the big topics is this thing called the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which is a collection of special protections that police officers get that you as a daily citizen won't get. And we've hacked away at this for the last couple of years. We're making progress, but it's still not fair. About 3 years ago, before we made any changes, if an officer was involved in a shooting or a murder or of some sort that was going to go into investigation, they wouldn't have to issue a statement before even their own colleagues, other police officers, for 10 days. After they've had a chance to talk to legal counsel, talk to all their buddies, get their story straight. So after we negotiated with the rest of our colleagues in Annapolis, we got them down to 5 days, and it's just like, well, I could call everyone in my phone book in 48 hours, that doesn't take much. That's not justice. If you were to get pulled over, that's not, that wouldn't be fair. Right. And there are a lot of ideas out here on how we can move forward. I tend to not be the one on officers have to live in, that exact same jurisdiction, only because officers tend not to make that much money, to be honest with you too. So, you have to set up things that make sense. If you're going to require officers to live in the local jurisdiction, then you should make sure the local jurisdiction, speaking to Dr. Carter's point earlier, is affordable for people who make everyday American wages to live in those communities through tax incentives and the like. But ultimately, you need more community control. So we have these community oversight boards, civilian review boards for police officer violence and the like. And more often than not, I know it's the case throughout Maryland, you're only on those boards if you're appointed by the police chief, okay? And the board can only see any cases that are referred to them by the police chief as well, okay? So most of the disciplinary process has no community oversight, and even the community people who could be there are folks who's more to be inclined to agree with the position that the police chief already has. So some simple changes people have is just kind of like, well, if you elect me and I have no say over who's on the civilian review board, then that makes people think our government is broken. This is all a hoax. Why am I going to call and report something that happened to me or my loved one if I know nothing's going to come of it? Which means less people call, okay? And becomes this downward spiral where government is not working. And I think the outpouring that we're seeing of people is them feeling like their government isn't working for them, which leads them to say phrases like defund the police, because there's just a lack of faith in the system, and that's what we need to get to. Majority of police policy is done at the state level, not federal. Also, you know, the federal control it mostly from interstate commerce clause, essentially saying, generally speaking, professional standards should be the same across states, but their review process is completely different from state to state, which makes this issue of bringing accountability much more difficult because we have to have a 50-state strategy on moving things forward. So I'll stop there, but I can go on and on about police.
Thank you. On this same topic, what do you think our new relationship with the police should look like?
I'll start. I'll be shorter this time so Dr. Carter can hop in. So I actually think these institutions, you know, policing as we know it was built off of the Fugitive Slave Act, right? We didn't have police as we know it until then, and then those police were essentially built for the exclusive purpose of finding freed slaves and bringing them back into servitude. And I start there to say that policing as we know it was not built for or by Black people. It did not exist for the benefit of Black people. So you can't necessarily amend something that its root purpose wasn't for our benefit. You have to completely start over with a completely different mindset of how are you going to engage in community to be a guardian instead of a warrior, you know? So I think the way we get towards our ideal relationship with police is one that is focused on community uplift. You know, we pulled the records for 911 calls. About 4% of police calls are focused on violent acts like, you know, murder or rape or even things dealing with narcotics and drugs. Another 11% deal with auto incidents. So you tie that together, 15% is what you would probably think we need police for, you know? The remaining 85% are for completely unrelated things. You know, so I think between a mix of you know, pipelining social workers or creating, let's say, like a health services corps within our police departments that can actually deal with the majority of issues that they're getting called about, like, you know, someone is homeless, someone is having a bad reaction to a drug they took, you know, someone is reporting that kids are skipping school. I mean, these are the majority of the things that are getting called on. You know, you need to know how to de-escalate situations. You need to know how, more like community organizing, how to build community, connect with people. And it requires different folks within your force. You know, maybe we don't even call it a police force. You know, maybe we call it a community corps of some site. You get retirees who can come in as mediators to help de-escalate domestic situations. You know, it's a completely different viewpoint than this almost, you know, military in wait position that we currently have. You know, so my position is that, you know, trying to amend a system that wasn't built for our benefit is a waste of time. We're always going to knock heads with people who just philosophically does not view what we intend needs to happen. We need to have a top to bottom review, often like we do with our schools. You know, so if a school is not performing well based off of, you know, expectations that parents have, community have, oftentimes we shut down that school, bring in completely new actors to lead that school and get buy-in from the community. I think that is the essential purpose of government. You know, you're supposed to represent the people, and we need to have that approach when it comes to the police department.
Thank you. Dr. Ali Carter, did you want to add anything to this topic?
No, I mean, I thought that was a comprehensive response. I do love the idea of having a health corps within a department. You know, all of the ideas that you mentioned, even like changing the name, is neutralizing power differences. And I think that's what this comes down to, is how do we begin to neutralize the power differential that's inherent in, you know, the police department and the community, right? So I don't have anything meaningful to add out. I would just say that I love the ideas that you have, and even having a collaboration or a core of professionals who are in the health service, like psychologists or social workers. I think the education and training and the consciousness raising around implicit bias, I think that's a perfect opportunity or a perfect way to begin to introduce that. You can't have, well, I'm not in the police force, so I don't know how training is done currently if they contract out, but I just think that would be a nice way to sort of monitor and reinforce the education and experiential exercises around implicit bias that is at the hands of a lot of these horrible, unjustified killings. So nothing meaningful to add, just that.
Thank you.
Dr. Ali Carter said it. Sorry, I was going to hop in just a minute. They get about 600 hours of training during the academy in total, mostly on investigations and stuff like that. 8 of those 600 hours are on de-escalation, and there's no mandated hours on implicit bias currently.
That is horrible. It should be integrated and weaved into every module, every training. I mean, you know, I went to University of Maryland, obviously, go Terps, and then I also went to Howard. And so my experiences with understanding diversity were completely different. So for example, in a University of Maryland course, one of my psychology courses might have one day designated to diversity within the entire the course syllabus, right? The entire course schedule. Howard University, just because of part of its mission, because of the legacy, the intimate relationship with the professors. I mean, I don't have to say more, it's a HBCU, but that stuff is tied into every lecture, every course, every assignment. And so that repetition and those experiential exercises are really the way to raise awareness. I mean, you learn about your own biases as a Black person. And so that is unacceptable. I was not aware of those numbers. So yeah, back to your original point about having some type of profession, whether it's health or psychologists or social workers, to be a part of or spearhead that initiative in training and education.
I will also add, even though I'm the moderator, if I can, I'm on the Citizens Advisory Council for the Howard County Police. So I know that they do have actually a health component, a health unit within their police officers who go out to calls that seem to be people in health crisis, and that they just expanded the unit within a year or two ago. So I think that's a start, and if more police departments do that, I think that can be really beneficial, because they follow up with people that they come in contact with and try to provide them with services. So as police officers paired with social workers, and I think they work with the health department. So I think that's a great way to address the situation. It's a small unit, but it's something. So
yeah, and I will add to that I think even there could be bias within the health field. So I am a mental health provider, and I don't think that just formal education and training in mental health would help me understand the nuanced and complex presentations of health within the African American community. So I would just add that even within these health cores, right, even within the mental health profession or the health profession, it's not sufficient just to have specific knowledge base in that area, but in order to be value added, you really have to understand the complexities of the Black community, the Black presentation, Black history. So making sure that we equip these health corps that are attached to the police officers with people who have that experience, have that passion, are invested in that piece, in particular for the Black community.
So just to move on a little bit, I guess to continue on with the discussion about police, it's also created, this climate that we're in has been an increase in racial tensions. And it's not just this year, it's kind of been building on through the last several years. So the next question is, how can we minimize the emotional impact of racial tensions on Black children? This is for the good doctor.
Thank you. Sorry, I got distracted reading the chat. So how can we minimize the emotional impact of race tensions on Black children? So I am an adult psychologist. I will couch my answer with that. But when you think about the current climate and trying to reduce just trauma, right? Because this is very traumatizing. It's in our face. It's repeated. It's all day. I mean, this has been quite traumatizing. I like to go back to being simplistic. It's all about balance and boundaries. So I think it's important that we talk to kids about what's going on. Children are very, very smart. And so without that dialogue, they're left to navigate difficult racial situations. They're left to navigate very raw emotion on their own. So I think it's important that parents and trusted community members and trusted adults and trusted people, people who are safe spaces within the village are having these conversations with children. I think it's important to not only be having these very difficult conversations, but if you go back to balance, right, and boundaries, I think that we have to be intentional, especially at a time like this, with introducing our children to the beauty of Blackness, Black art, Black culture, Black language, the beauty, the jewels of our culture. So I do think that if you're doing one, you have to be intentional about filling kids up with the other. The other slippery slope is creating a narrative, especially during this time, that all white people are racist, that people don't get it. And, I think that that's a slippery slope. I do think that there for sure are bad apples, and there is for sure ignorance, but there's also people and allies and people who are able to be agents of change that are well-intended, that don't look like us. So a part of this process, I think, is also instilling like what I call cultural humility in children, having them understand that people are different, but approaching situations, new people and diversity with an open mind, because we cannot expect children we can't expect children, we can't say to children, people should love you, people should respect you, you are important, but at the same time not cultivate that into them, not teaching them that we have to approach people who are different from us the same way that we want people to approach us. And I know that's hard to do, particularly when I say emotions are raw and then just racial trauma is in our face, but that's an important piece that we should be cultivating cultural humility in kids, appreciation of diversity, so they can understand when people don't get them, not accept it, understand it, and they could begin to also approach people who are different from them the same way that they want to be treated. So back to the golden rule, treat people how you want to be treated, right? That's what the message of the Black Lives Matter movement is. In order to do that, we also have to make sure that we're teaching the children that. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, let's talk about voting. It's a big election year. 2020 is when we vote for a new president. Delegate Jazz Lewis, tell us, how can people get their ballots?
In the primary, we mailed ballots to everyone who was registered to vote. And it was a whole host of problems in our most diverse jurisdictions. They received their ballots the last, and we have very limited in-person voting options, and there were lines all around buildings and down the streets, and it was very problematic. I think a lot of folks are expecting it to roll just like that in the general. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The governor decided he wants to run the election like a normal election. So if you want to mail in a ballot so that you can vote remotely and safely, you're going to have to request it in advance. You can go to the Maryland Board of Elections to do so, to request an application. You don't have to have an excuse or anything like that. We already fixed that in Maryland. If you want to vote by mail, as we call it, just request it. They'll mail it to you, and then you'll have to either mail it back in, or they'll have drop-off boxes starting in, I think, mid-September for people to drop off their ballots ahead of time. It is critically important, personally, I care a little bit about who you vote for, but for the most part, I do think it's important that we vote. I have read a ton of polling as of lately that America's new swing voter are young Black people. And it's not, the question isn't who we're voting for, it's whether we're voting at all. And I think it's because, I think we've seen so many folks who the first person they ever voted for was Barack Obama, or he was one of the first folks they voted for, and they were so excited in our nation and where we were going. And then seeing so much, and sometimes I feel like as a people, and I'm not just saying Black people, but as like American people, over this last decade, we just had like a lot of collective trauma, and faith in institutions has been broken. That the polling I'm seeing is that young Black people are deciding whether they're going to vote or not, which is making them a new form of swing voter that sways things in and of itself. So I still have faith. I still believe it is important for us to vote. Vote however you're comfortable with. We are pressing the Board of Elections to have at least 283 voting locations across the state, which is way smaller than the normal 1,400 we have. And the reason for that is that our elections are overwhelmingly a volunteer-run process of seniors and retirees and folks like that administering our elections as election judges at your local high school or church or community center. And about 1,000, a little over 1,000 of our election judges quit about 2 weeks ago because they are all vulnerable populations, and they're not trying to risk themselves being, exposed to the virus. And I think it's completely justifiable. I, for one, have been making videos to try to encourage more younger folks to sign up. That includes the folks on this call. You can sign up to be an election judge. You get paid to serve as an election judge. It's only for the time you're there. I think it's about $150 a day. So both from early vote, which lasts about 10 days, and election day, you can, make the money while you're there. So we need to have an in-person option just in case people request their ballots and there's issues, but we are still recommending people requesting a vote by mail as much and as often as possible so that you can vote from your kitchen table or wherever as safely as we can.
And what happens if you don't get your ballot?
So because we're not mailing them out, everyone shouldn't expect a ballot to begin with unless you request one. If you request one and it doesn't come, you can still vote in person. Okay, you can still go to early vote or election day and vote in person. There'll be a lot of hours, and they are trying to make sure we have processes in place so that you don't have to worry about people congregating and things like that, so we can do so securely and safely. But if you request a ballot and it doesn't come within 2 weeks or so, please call your local Board of Elections. You can also request it and print it is another option instead of them mailing it to you. I almost forgot to mention that. You can request one and they can email it to you and you can print it out and then send it in from there as well. And each of your ballot is coded. They have a unique code to every individual person. So you shouldn't have to worry about any type of fraud. Anyone telling you about voter fraud is just trying to scare people out of voting. There has been no data to suggest any fraud. There's been very few legal cases confirming any type of fraud as well. And we have elections multiple times a year all across this country. It's never been an issue. It is a made up partisan issue that is not real.
So how do we get Black voters to understand the need to vote for a viable candidate when the candidate choice is no longer on the ballot?
And by this, I would just use an example. We're saying, let's say a candidate was very invested in Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Kamala Harris, and they're no longer on the ballot. So in a two-party system, and there's, pluses and minuses to that, and I'm not going to bore you all with all of those intricacies right now, but the pluses is that there are multiple times to influence the process. So typically what happens is you have a primary, as many people as whoever wants, and it becomes a contest of ideas. And as candidates tend to fall off, either because they can't sustain it financially or because they don't see a pathway for themselves or whatnot, the remaining candidates often end up adopting the popular ideas that candidate has, so that the final candidate ends up with all of these ideas that they may not have started with. Now, their priority of those become an issue, and the way you try to influence that is typically during the convention, okay? Because then it's no longer you as a candidate, now you're the nominee for this entire party, and they put together a platform that is now your platform. It's a collective platform that everyone has had, and you try to influence that. In 2016, that was one of the conditions that Bernie Sanders had with Hillary Clinton, that he was only going to acknowledge defeat if she essentially took on like 70% of his platform, which she did. And that became the Democratic Party's national platform. The Republican convention didn't really do that. Trump kind of stuck to what he said in the beginning and didn't really move even after their convention. I saw there was a question in the chat saying that how can we let young people know that third-party candidates like Kanye West can affect the election outcome? I trust the public. I mean, there's some folks who go to the polls and they write in Fuzzy the Bear just because they think, I actually know a couple people in 2016 who wrote Fuzzy the Bear instead of either voting for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, and they thought it was funny. I think folks are aware now that this is not a game. Many folks, I think, took for granted that Donald Trump could seriously win. And I'm not assuming everyone on the call is a Democrat or anything like that. But just polling indicates to me that most Americans ain't feeling bruh. So I can safely say that. And going into this upcoming election, I think people are more aware of the consequences of those. Now, should we have third-party candidates? And should there be multiple parties so that, in particular, African Americans who often feel like our vote is taken for granted by the Democratic Party can have another option to bring our issues and concerns to the forefront? And on one side, I say yes. From another perspective, I say, well, I don't know, because if we had a ton of small issue specific parties, I think the fact that Donald Trump is still polling around, the high 30s, low 40s, shows there's a large swath of Americans that are in tune with his, racist, xenophobic, sexist beliefs, and they were to form their own large minor party. they can end up beating out all these other ones. And that is what we've seen has happened. That's what happened in England. That's happened in a lot of Europe. And that actually happened in Brazil, where they have a right-wing leader now. So I think we should be careful about that. But I trust the American people. I even trust the young folks that, you know, if they want to vote for, there's a few people who may vote for Kanye West. But the majority of them, I think, are going to do what they think is right for our country and them as people. I trust the voters.
Thank you, Delegate Lewis. Let's take a minute to talk about mental health. Mental health in the Black community has always had a bit of a stigma. So Dr. Mana, can you talk a little bit about how do we get past the stigma of mental health treatment within the Black community, and specifically with Black men?
Sure. I always like to start off with empathy, even for difficult topics like stigma. So I think first we must come to an understanding of why stigma even exists around the mental health community. Mental health within the Black community. You know, historically, Black people in the United States did not have the luxury of having a mental health disorder. They did not have the luxury of being depressed or the luxury of having anxiety, because there were serious consequences, imminent consequences, if you even displayed emotion, right? These display rules that you put on your strong face and you keep pushing. There were, I mean, if you think back to Jim Crow South, there were serious consequences for being human or not being rigid and stiff or walking in a straight line. So I think that it comes from our history for sure. I think that in some areas of the Black community, there is a conflict with spirituality and religious beliefs and mental health. And that's understandable, right? So I think that one, we must not judge stigma and put it into a proper context. So the next step is, I think there are allies and I think there are providers. I think there are mental health professionals. I know there are mental health professionals. I know there are doctors who get that. And I know what we know in the research is that people of color who find race concordant relationships with health providers, so African Americans who work with African Americans, they tend to have, one, better awareness of mental health, two, greater adherence to mental health recommendations, and three, just greater health and mental health outcomes. So just that rapport is more effective than any pill or any prescription or any recommendation that I give you. If you trust me, we are likely to do better work and make changes for your wellness. So we know that. So my first thing is, I would encourage people to seek out providers and professionals that look like them. And whether the professionals are like them or not, right? Because that's an illusion that everyone who is Black have the same interest. That's not true, but that doesn't matter. That the research shows that doesn't matter. That it's just after controlling for all these variables that they can show that sometimes race concordant relationships are effective. So the same way that, I don't know if you all have looked at some like doctor's offices that they brand themselves like LGBTQI allies, there are mental health practices that have very clear language that they value culture, they value diversity, they invite members of the Black community. So I would encourage people to start there. The other thing I want to encourage people to do is start normalizing these tough discussions. I found, particularly in group therapy sessions, when people start to disclose, like, oh, I really feel down, that it opens up a can of worms that everyone starts to get permission to have an emotion other than I'm happy, I'm all right all the time. So I will say that having these uncomfortable discussions with your friends, with your community members, to start to normalize that we're human and we're allowed to be not okay sometimes. I think is so important. I will say another barrier to mental health treatment and seeking mental health treatment is people just aren't aware when they are off. People don't really recognize the symptoms of depression or PTSD because it might show up different in the Black community. I spoke a little bit about this earlier. So, you know, the media portrays depression as like I'm sitting watching a movie, crying, eating a pail of ice cream. Depression does not show up like that for people in the Black community. Depression shows up as irritability. It shows up as alcohol and drug use. It shows up as disrupted sleep. It shows up as overeating. It shows up as undereating. And so if people don't have the awareness to say, these areas of my life are different and attach it to a mental health condition, they're not going to seek treatment. They're going to plow through. And so I think, again, this goes back to you know, systemic change and really infiltrating education and training programs with providers to begin to create a workforce of people who can begin to do the work in the community, reach out to community members, create connections so we are destigmatizing mental health. I never have difficulty with reaching out to the stereotypical difficult patient to reach. For example, I'm in the spinal cord injury unit, and so a lot of our patients that come in are victims of gunshot wounds to the spinal cord and only paralyzed. And these are folks who, you know, the attending physician will say, the psychologist is going to come in here and see you. And they say, no, they're not. No, she's not going to come in here and see me. And then I walk in, and then as soon as they see, again, we could have nothing in common, but as soon as they see that I'm a Black professional, they give me a shot, they give me a chance. So, you know, I will say people don't feel encouraged or don't feel like they have power in that situation, but you have power to choose your providers. You do not have to stay or have a provider that you do not feel like is a good fit for you. So yes, find an ally or a provider or in the community, or get recommendations from people in your trusted village. Normalize tough discussions. Give people permission, even in your own circle, to have emotions other than, oh, I'm okay. And let's start to bring awareness to the issue.
So we had one question from the chat. Once a patient seeks assistance via a medical professional, is this something that must be disclosed when applying for jobs or health or life insurance?
No, so that's another barrier, right? People are afraid that there are going to be ramifications at work. So there are laws that protect people. I would encourage people to look into like the Americans Disability Act or HIPAA laws that protect you from disclosing any disability, and that includes a mental health disability. So you do have to disclose that you have a disability if you want accommodations at work. You know, there's usually EEO and human resources and systems in place to protect you as you navigate that. But under no circumstance do you have to go to a colleague or your boss and say, hey, I have a serious mental health condition. I'm taking these medications. You do not have to do that. You're protected in that way. So I hope that answered the questions. And the folks have either would like actual literature or direction to that language. Chmaika is going to be providing our email addresses. So I'm happy to help people navigate that a little bit better.
If I can, because I was thinking I was going to share this on the earlier question. I am not in the health profession whatsoever, but something I found, because I chaired the family law subcommittee, and I'm often on these calls about fatherhood and what men can do to address domestic violence. And we start talking about like inborn trauma that these men have experienced and how men need to step up. And something that, you know, along with talking to other men, that has helped get Black men in particular open to the possibility of talking to someone is like offering them baby steps first, where it's like, you know what, you've had a lot of trauma, you've had a lot of difficulty in your life. Just start journaling. You know, like take a moment, maybe once a week, maybe every 2 weeks, whenever you feel compelled. Don't make it feel like it's an obligation or a responsibility, and start journaling. And then when they circle back and start to feel like, man, that was so, you know, that allowed me to have a release or something like that. Then you start to have, I know the groups I'm with men, we start to have the conversation like, yeah, but then if you had a professional who can help you go at a deeper depth, imagine the benefit that can be for you and your family. So I just want to share that too, because I know particularly Black men can be very resistant. You know, we almost take it as, what are you saying is wrong with me, when you suggest it often. And if you're nervous about that, offer them baby steps, because you know, it's still a cry for help, even if they are resisting. But maybe they just need to work up to it.
And I would say, for men in particular, I think that it's a socialization process. It starts off very young. You know, I have 2 little boys, and when they fall and hurt themselves and they cry, I say it's okay to cry. And I think even just that begins to condition them to be okay with emotion, where, you know, the widespread belief is, you know, you hear these microaggressions, you're crying like a girl, you're doing that like a girl, and that gets deeply embedded and internalized. So it's not that Black men wake up one day and say, oh, I'm not having any emotions. This is a process that they've been groomed to be this way, whether it's within their own community or household, again, or if this is generational. Like I said, Black people did not have the luxury to have time to have emotion. They just did not, historically. So I just want to bring that up, because I think that if you all know little boys or young boys, or if you have boys, you can start in your own household, right? Just normalizing and giving young boys permission to have emotion, and try to be mindful of your, you know, your own microaggressions. You know, go play football and be tough. Well, how about we come over here and do some art? Or my boys have cooking sets, and, you know, their godmom buys them pink stuff. You know, like, so I think that it's up to us in our community to begin to break down those stereotypes and, you know, that generational stigma. I think it is steeped in our history.
Thank you. So I know that you touched on this a little bit before, Dr. Amana. How do you think that we should talk to our family and friends about making healthier choices when we have a history of unhealthy behaviors?
Is this with health in particular? So I'm guessing this has to do with, I'll talk about health globally. And when people come into my office and they start telling me that they want to change, like, their loved one or their partner, I always say, just stop right there. You cannot change anybody, okay? People have to be motivated to make changes on their own. So I will say this, there are 2 things that contribute to behavior change. And that's one, importance. The behavior has to be important to that person. And if it's not, you won't see behavior change. The second thing is that they have to feel confident that they have the ability and resources to be successful at it. So if I don't think that I can stop smoking cigarettes, I'm not going to stop smoking cigarettes. If cigarettes are not important, if that's not an important goal of mine, I'm not going to do it. So I think the question is not how can I begin to change my family members' health decisions, is how can I contribute to this being important to them, or contribute to them having confidence that they can do that. And I think, you know, there's lots of ways to do it. As psychologists, we're trained on all these fancy techniques, but I think that there are practical things that you can do in your everyday life when you're talking to people that you love. I don't think, you know, the fear tactic works. In fact, research knows the fear tactic doesn't work. If let's say the behavior is smoking, showing someone a black lung is not going to make them stop smoking. People who smoke cigarettes usually know they can get lung cancer. So people are usually aware of the consequences of their behaviors. I never met someone who does drugs or eat lots of sugar or whatever, or don't exercise, who say, oh yeah, this is healthy for me. So I think the fear tactic does not work. What I encourage people to do is the exact opposite, to approach people with affirmations and love, to ask open-ended questions. For example, is this sounds really, really weird, but I promise you it's effective, to ask people what they like about whatever the behavior is. What do you like about watching TV all day on the couch, right? Or what do you like about smoking cigarettes? Because then what you'll start to see is that every problem started off as a solution, right? So, oh, I like smoking cigarettes because it helps me relax. Oh, you like relaxing. So maybe we can think about going to a park on a walk. Or, oh, why do you sit in front of the TV all day? Well, I really like game shows. I like to, spark my curiosity is a value of mine. Oh, let's go over here and do this game. So it's a radically different approach, that you are trying to affirm people where they're good at and cultivate their strengths and what's important to them to activate change. I will say that the buzz is in the behavior as a term that I like. So the more you can get people talking about behavior change, the more likely they're able to make it. So Adia, if you called me and you said, hey, mommy, you want to go to a party this weekend? You call me on Sunday. And I'm like, okay, yeah, call me later, girl. I'll go to the party with you. If you don't call me until Saturday, probably won't go. Probably will tell you I have something else to do. If you call me Sunday and say, hey, mommy, you want to go to the party? I'm like, okay, girl. And then you call me Monday and say, what are you wearing? And then you call me Tuesday and say, what song are we going to request? And then you call me Thursday and say, who should ride in the car with us with our masks because we are pandemic responsible? And this is an outdoor party, by the way, with social distancing. By the time Saturday comes, Adia, and you call me, I am more likely to go than I am in the first scenario. So if you get people talking about what's important to them, their values, their behavior changes that you love, and you start to build their confidence and their importance, you're more likely to see change. I do not believe people wake up and say, hey, yeah, I want to have cardiovascular disease, sign me up for that. Or, I want to be overweight, or I want to have depression. People do inherently want to be well. I believe that. I wouldn't be a psychologist if I thought that people woke up and said, sign me up for a day full of problems. That's not how we work, right? This goes back to just basic biology. We are driven to survive. We are wired to survive. And so when people are off track, it's not because they want to be there. And that's important, because I know we can get frustrated with our family members and our loved ones. Like, if you just don't get up, you just don't do this thing. So I give that context so you can approach these very tricky and difficult discussions with empathy and compassion, and you're more likely to see behavior change with that approach. So long story short, try compassion, open-ended questions, affirmations, and pouring into their confidence and pouring into making it important to them. And don't use the fear tactic. It does not work.
One last question on this topic. You had a question come in from the audience. At what point do you realize that pharmaceutical intervention is required to assist an individual overcome a behavior or action?
So I am very conservative in my approach. I know, and research points to the fact that there are interventions and there are things that we can do that don't involve medication that help people feel better. So I will explain the differences between psychology and psychiatry. Psychiatry prescribes medication, although there's some jurisdictions who allow psychologists to do this. I have my own thoughts about that, but that's for a different topic. But psychologists are trained in evidence-based protocols and interventions to move people in the right direction. We know they work. There would not be a field of psychology if it did not work. So there are some mental health conditions that do fare well fare better with pharmacological intervention. So psychosis, auditory and visual hallucinations, some, depending on how severe bipolar, but there are other things that we can do. So when I suggest someone to get medication, it's when their symptoms are so severe and so frequent that they are functionally impairing. So the depression is so severe that your suicidal ideation is every day, all day, or your anxiety is so bad that you can't function at work and it's interfering in your relationships. Maybe not so much that, but like maybe you've developed a panic attack. So I say based on the severity, without remission for an extended amount of time with some of the behavioral cognitive interventions that psychology do. So for me, I think certain symptoms require immediate pharmacological intervention like psychosis, but some I would not go there unless symptoms aren't remitting or they are extremely functionally impairing. We know that, and I'm also conservative because I work in the medical system, and so people's, especially Black people, their medical records are littered with mental health conditions. So this person has depression, this person has anxiety, and these are diagnoses that were given to them by like a primary care physician or something. And this is the problem, because this is how we begin to overdiagnose and misdiagnose African Americans, and this is when the over-medication comes. And this is what perpetuates mistrust and fear, institutionalization, and all these horrible things. So part of my reason that I am conservative is for that reason exactly. I always do my own assessment, and I never jump the gun on pharmacological intervention. Now, you might find psychologists who disagree with my approach, but that's just my personal approach to treating mental health in the Black community.
Okay, switching topics. I know recently the city of Asheville, North Carolina voted in favor of reparations for the Black community. So what is your opinion on reparations, and what do you think reparations looks like for us? This is a question for both of you.
I love this topic. I think reparations is relative, and I say that because when you get down, are you talking about a cash transfer for a broad swath of Black folks? Which Black folks are included in this cash transfer or not? Is it only those who are descendants of slaves, right? Or is it also shared with everyone else? If your family's been here since the 60s and has dealt with all the challenges of being Black in America through all of that and participated, there's a conversation there. When you're pulled over, even if you just arrived here a decade ago, and let's say if you're, a Nigerian mom and you have a Black son here, when he starts driving, he gets pulled over, they're not thinking, oh, he's different. He's not descendant of slaves, he's Igbo, no. So it's very different. From a policy perspective, I'm gonna think about it because I tend to focus on racial wealth issues too. I'm gonna take a racial wealth perspective, that the single policy decision that really helped to build the broader white middle class was the GI Bill. And after tens of thousands of Americans served in World War II, they came back with the promise that, hey, we will help pay for your education, and when you want to start a home, the government will foot the bill for the down payment for you, right? That allowed a lot of white Americans that were still low income at the time, living in government subsidized housing or living in essentially inner city communities, because we forget that prior to World War II, we were actually less segregated in this country than we are now. It allowed them to go and start wealth for their families and build the suburbs and things like that. But due to redlining, like Dr. Ali Carter referenced earlier, Black soldiers weren't allowed to do the same thing. You know, so even though we had this benefit that we were entitled to, because zoning laws were controlled at the local level, we were pushed out, right? And then a whole generation was missed, you know, on that. And as a result, for that and so many other atrocities, we saw the civil rights movement. I, for one, think we need to have like another social contract with Black folks focus on issues like this, on, you know, whether it's housing attainment or maybe like a deal like we have for, you know, DC youth. You know, if you graduate from DC public schools, you know, you go to any public state university for free. With in-state costs or something like that. It's cheaper for them as if they were in-state because they're not in-state, and that was one of the things that they worked out. There are conversations like that. You know, a 529 plan that you can use for not just education, but maybe a down payment for a house for every Black American that's born for like a generation or so. But I think it's critically important from my perspective to focus on a racial wealth thing, because I think that the big pull for the 40 acres and a mule is the idea that had you had 40 acres in livestock to raise on it, you would be able to sustain yourself separate from society, right? And I think too often, the Black community in particular, we just can't, you know, because whether it is us being forced into low-wage jobs because we haven't appropriately invested in our education system, or discrimination in the workplace where even if you are qualified, like we know Black Americans take on, you know, 2 times to 3 times as much debt in obtaining our education as our white colleagues, just to get jobs and get paid less than they are, assuming we got called back for an interview in the first place, you know? And those are problems. I think some of the ways we build that is that if we had our own wealth from our own assets, then we could generate our own companies and hire ourselves, right? And then we can compete on even footing in the global market. So that's some of the ideas I think we can do. I will say I've gotten a lot of pushback on this subject from, in particular, white baby boomers who viewed desegregation in and of itself, well, in education and things like that, as reparations. And we need to have a serious conversation about how we also talk about this with folks who could also be potentially allies in getting their mindset right, because I had to have very, what's the word, crucial conversations, I think is the best way to put that, with folks who I think are on our side, but are like, Jazz, I don't get what you're saying here. This is now starting to seem like special treatment. I thought affirmative action and desegregating our schools and stuff was that. And it's just like, no, you all got a unique benefit that everyone else was not able to receive, right? You all received reparations in the GI Bill. We're saying the same thing that happened for us that was promised. But within the family, we need to have a conversation on how broad-based that is, like I started with.
So, you know, this is a tangent, but I promise I'll circle around. So when you were talking about desegregation, I'll never forget this. I had an interaction with, he was 90 years old at the time in hospice. I used to work in hospice as when I was doing psychology training, and he grew up in the civil rights era. He grew up, you know, during Jim Crow laws and, you know, in southern states. And he said to me, he said, I think desegregation was the worst thing that happened to the Black community. He was like, when we were segregated, there was more of a sense of a community. We were more likely to buy from Black business owners. We were more likely to pour into our community wholeheartedly. And so I just thought that was an interesting perspective. And I think that I'm not saying that I agree with it, but I think that we can have both, right? So you know, to your point, I do think reparations, like my skin crawls when I read articles or literature or perspectives about just some monetary lump sum of money to, you know, make it all go away. Literally, I have a visceral response to that, because what Black people have been through in this country, it's not commensurate to a lump sum of money. It's just not. It's just not. And so, as you were talking about, Delegate Lewis, how can we begin to create wealth? How can we begin to create ownership? How do we create the pipeline, not from school to prison, but from school to graduate school? How do we begin to infiltrate the table, right? Because if you think about, again, I think the root of everything is racism, layered racism, systemic racism. Racism, what that is it's rooted in power and privilege. It's socially constructed, right? So to me, the solution is how do, again, we begin to neutralize the power differential. And that's having a seat at every table. That's having a seat at corporations, having a seat in education. I mean, we need to be moving up the ladder. And like I said, a byproduct of that is wealth and money, but we really need to be at the table, because power and privilege in America is about who owns resources, who can shake and move policy. That's where people who look like us need to be. And so I don't have any grand ideas about, you know, how to make sure that happens, but I think that whatever solutions and legislation and programs that we propose should be, how do we begin to decrease the power and privilege gap in education? And I think just a byproduct of that as well. So one other thing I will say, because I'm in mental health, that we need to be well if we're going to show up. We need to be well spiritually, emotionally, physically. And so reparations should also be relevant to the domain of health and wellness. So whether that's free mental health care, whether that's free education for mental health care providers who look like to become the Black community, to move into mental health professional positions or medical providers. We need to be well. We need people who look like us showing up at the table in that domain. And so there should be some way to foster that easily and accessibly in the Black community. So that's the piece I will add. Reparations need to be around health and mental health.
Speaking of mental health, how can we mentally and emotionally protect ourselves while staying knowledgeable, engaged, and involved?
I keep unmuting, sorry. So I don't think my answer to that is gonna be different from anything that I've said already about just balance and boundaries, right? So everyone has a different emotional capacity. And I do think it's important to face a lot of this trauma and these issues, like look it in the eye, get to know it intimately, but that is taxing. That is taxing emotionally, cognitively, spiritually. And so we have to intentionally fill ourselves up, meaning as we do these things that pull from our spirit, this pull from our energy, how do we also replenish that, right? So balance. And the way to know if you're balanced is if you feel good. And so let me clarify that, because a lot of people think about feeling good and feeling bad dichotomously, meaning that if I feel bad, I can't feel good. Or if I feel good, I can't feel bad, that these things are mutually exclusive, but you can be both, and you have to make sure you're both. So you can be sad and angry at what's happening, but at the same time, able to cultivate gratitude that you're alive, or connectedness with a higher power, or happy for your family. So I think one thing to do is start to change your conceptualizations, how emotions show up for you, and making sure that, yes, the bad emotions will be there, bad in parentheses, since, you know, I put that in parentheses and say bad loosely, but those emotions will be there. Anxiety will be there, not shake, you know, just we live in certain times. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're trying to, you know, resist racial trauma and tension. So the anxiety is going to be there. The sadness is going to be there. The anger, the resentment, the fear, all that stuff is going to be there. But are we intentionally cultivating a softness? And that can exist simultaneously. So I will say, just take inventory, try to create homeostasis, right? This goes back to my point about us, you know, just going back to evolutionary perspectives. We are wired to want to survive. We are wired to want to be even, right? So if I eat, I'm going to use the bathroom. If I'm hungry, I'm going to eat. If I'm hot, if I'm hot, I'm going to sweat to cool me down, right? So we are wired to sort of be even and to have a set point, right? So that is also applicable to our emotional status. So even if we get uneven, even if we get angry or resentful, or, you know, that's failing us, we always have to be mindful and take inventory. How do we get back to our set point? Again, that's different for different people. For some, it's, you know, prayer, some is meditation, some is taking a walk, some is playing with their children. It's just different, and you're the expert on you. So I would encourage you again to take inventory of your values and your strengths. But I will say we are a resilient people. So we are. So I hope that the conversation about mental health and its existence and the presence of anxiety and fear doesn't make you all feel broken or fragile, because we are a resilient people. So just keep that in mind, our history and the challenges that we individually and collectively have had to endure and are still are enduring.
Thank you. Delegate Jazz Lewis, do you have any organizations that people can contact to get more involved?
Sure. I have a host, and this isn't a fully comprehensive list, but I was thinking about this because I knew this question was coming. You know, there are a number. I mean, it spans what your interest is, of course. You know, but I'm going to put a couple on just on some of the issues I engage with often. So the ACLU of Maryland, right? The ACLU of Maryland does a lot of work from advocating in Annapolis or in local governments or federally on issues. They also represent people in their communities, and they do a lot of like community teach-ins. If you want to know your rights or things like that, or you just want to volunteer locally to talk to students about what their rights are, or go into HOAs and tell them what their rights are. Like there are things that whatever your comfort level you can do. So I would recommend talking to them. Progressive Maryland is one of the lefty statewide organizations that are advocating for a world where everyone has shared governance and say and feel valued. They're more direct, in your face advocacy, right? The brother who leads it, Larry Stafford, is a close friend of mine, and sometimes I got to tell him, calm down. They will. If you want to do something because that's necessary too, right? If you're frustrated and you just really want to let people know in a more direct action type of way, you can get involved with them. Casa de Maryland, the Black community is not just made up of folks who have that Southern Black experience of folks moving from the Deep South up north, or even being up north for generations. It is also part of the broader Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, from the continent, from just across the globe, and they deal with immigration issues. Of course, it deals a lot with the Latino community, but here in Maryland, we have a very large Cameroonian, Nigerian, Senegalese community, Sierra Leonean, and they represent them too, and just helping them get set up. So if you're concerned about those intersections of immigration and advocacy with our community, they're a good one to talk to. Job Opportunity Task Force. They're based in Baltimore, but they're trying to become more statewide, that they focus on poverty issues and how they can essentially take communities that are beneath the federal poverty rate and get them out of. And they connect with employers, they do training programs, they do advocacy, of course. And one of the things that they've gotten to is they focus on why are the wage rates and income rates for the Black community disproportionately lower than others. And it's because, 1 out of every 3 Black boys right now, as they say, based on the data, will experience incarceration over their lifetime if we don't change something. And then when you have that red herring of a criminal conviction, it lowers your options of getting education, housing, and the like. So it's moved them, particularly as they are trying to target select communities, into criminal justice reform, because it has a huge, in addition to like the family mental health stuff, but a huge monetary impact on the Black household, and whether we are above or beneath the poverty rate. Of course, there's our traditional organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League that are well known, but there are other ally-based organizations that I think folks should be comfortable engaging with as well, like Jews United for Justice. I do a lot of work on solitary confinement and things that I just think are really focused on human rights issues, and they are with me every step of the way. The broader Jewish community, just the broader religious community, I think, whether it's also the Islam community and the like, they advocate for things beyond just their faith-based initiatives, right? So if you are someone of faith and are inspired by your faith and want to work with others, I think a number of these faith-based initiatives are great groups to work on. Everytown for gun safety, if you're concerned about gun violence, things like that, and UCAP. I'm really close with United Communities Against Poverty. Rashida Jameson runs UCAP for Prince George's County. Their focus, similarly to Job Opportunity Task Force, they're focused on lifting people out of poverty. One of the things they focus a lot on is housing, particularly housing for women and children. They have a shelter in my district in Capitol Heights. Periodically, I'll go bring supplies and stuff to them. But if you want to do a lot more direct volunteering with people, however that is, maybe you have a skill, maybe it's accounting, you help people with their taxes, right? These are things that everyday Americans, everyday Black folks need assistance with. If you're an educator and you want to volunteer, you know, our little babies in these shelters need tutors as well, you know? So whatever it is, there's something out there for you to be able to assist. You know, I know to Dr. Carr's point, we have different health clinics that we have created incentives for health clinics to start setting up in a number of our more underserved communities, because we know the disparities that are there, right? And they're always looking for as much help as they can get. And they will train you if you come to them to help out where and how you can, being non-certified and things like that. So I'm happy to follow with anyone if they email me and want to talk about organizations you know, in the state or nationally based on their interests.
I have a comment. This is parallel to what you're saying, and it definitely might be a radical shift in how we think about contributing to the causes that are important to us. But I would add that working on you and building yourself up and thinking big also is important. So I can give an example. You know, I wanted to be a researcher. I Googled, random Google search, I looked at the NIH and said, who has access to the population that I want to work with? And, you know, there was a lady at NIDDK who was studying African immigrants. I said, oh, this is cool. So I went to her. I mean, there was no formal program in place. There was no formal volunteer opportunity in place. And I said, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I think is important. And I literally, this was before I got immersed in my PhD program. I said, let me learn the research system so I can go ahead and infiltrate this and get myself in grad school and get ready to turn out this research on the vulnerable community. So a part of contributing to the larger cause, there might be a lag in time, but it's preparing yourself. It's pouring into yourself. It's teaching yourself. It's learning the ropes and the systems yourself. So maybe not in this moment. Currently, you know, you have the cognitive capacity or resources to do what you want to do, but you can show up later. So pouring into yourself now, I think, is just as important to contribute to. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. To contribute to, unfortunately, making a differences in the areas that we're talking about. So I know that's a little radically different, but it's just as important that we have to prepare ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. We have to invest in ourselves if we're ever going to be good to the broader community, our families, 100%.
Dr. Ali Carter, there was one question I skipped over earlier from the audience. It was asked, how do we secure voting positions on the review panels? Do you have an answer for that?
For a research review?
Yes, I think that's when you were talking about how to get the grant money for your proposals.
Yeah, so one, I think that like this goes back to preparing yourself. I think that in order to be on the research review panel and grant review panel, you have to have a knowledge about statistical analysis and theoretical frameworks, and you have to have the knowledge base. So one, I would encourage you to start to pour into your own knowledge base of how these things work. Most organizations, some organizations, I'll speak to, I'm in the healthcare system, are turning out research. So you can start at I don't like this word, but you can start in a position that's not a reviewer and work yourself up. So like I work at MedStar NRH, there's a whole research department. I'm a clinician, but there are opportunities for me to be involved in that department if I would like to, maybe not as a research reviewer, but getting my foot in the door, again, pouring into myself, you can obtain one of these. Once you obtain the knowledge, what happens is it really is like for journals that have peer reviews, like for those of you who are not familiar with research, there's scientific journals that people read that has like the latest and new literature. In order to get into those journals, your research or your perspective, it doesn't have to be a scientific research study, your perspective, your opinion, it has to be peer reviewed. So you can reach out to the editors. If you are in a particular field and have a knowledge base, you can reach out to the editors of the journal and let them know that you're interested in being a peer reviewer. And what will happen is they will continue to keep you as the person who's interested in review on their radar. And you can also put that on your resume and that on your CV, or CV if you use the CV, and begin to reach out to additional editors and additional review panels. So I would say first, build your knowledge base, because you have to be an expert to review this, not in everything, but you have to know something to look at a paper and say, oh, this is a solid paper, this is a rigorous paper, this is a grant that's worth funding. So build into your knowledge base and then start getting your foot in the door at whatever level that you can. Email editors, email organizations, and let them know that you're interested.
Thank you, everyone. On this note, we need to wrap things up because we're approaching 3 o'clock. So if the both of you would like to give your closing remarks, I will start with Delegate Lewis.
A sure thing. Adia, Cassie, Chmaika, thank you all for having us. I've really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I think the needs are high and have been high. But, you know, I had the fortune of planning a voting rights forum for Congressman John Lewis about 5 years ago. And before the event started, it's interesting because, you know, one of the things that popped up in this dialogue was on, I guess, maintaining yourself, taking care of yourself through the process and the like. And I asked him kind of like, you know, you've been in this fight, you know, your entire life. I mean, he started, you know, being active in the civil rights movement when he was 18 years old. And, you know, he was keeping the fight alive until he passed away at 80. And he told me, you know, he was just like, you know, you got to take, you know, you got to pause and reflect. Because if you don't pause and reflect, you may forget what you're doing all this for, right? In the first place. And you have to pause and reflect so that you don't hate white people, is what he told me, which was very real. And because if you realize, well, what are we trying to change, whether it's from these health inequities, the racial wealth, you know, disparities that we were talking about, you know, the quality of our education system. I mean, everything you can talk about. we're talking about fairness, we're talking about equality, you know, we're talking about human dignity. And if we want human dignity for ourselves, we want fairness for ourselves, equality for ourselves, then we have to be invested in also a partner and ally for health, for human dignity, for all these things, for everyone, okay? Everyone, because as he told me, you know, there are a lot of white folks who shed blood in the civil rights movement for us, for the only reason that they thought Jim Crow was a stain on the potential of America, right? And they knew that if you allowed this to continue, it would only get worse. And then somehow, some way, whether they were Italian or they were Jewish or they were Irish or whatever, it was affecting them too, somehow, some way. And we're all only liberated when all of us are liberated, right? You know, so I'm going to stay in that fight. I think it's 100% okay for people to get active however they can, in their capacity they can. I just pray that people keep faith alive, like John Lewis told me, and keep moving forward however we can. And that's what's most important. I'm really happy with the leadership where the university is going. There was a question earlier on about how, as we're talking about equity and implicit bias on the university, just to bring it back to us as alums a little bit, what can we do on campus for faculty and the like? And I actually battled former President Wallace Lowe over an initiative that on day one, President Pines has already initiated, which I thank him for, which is essentially mandating implicit bias training for all the faculty and all the students coming into the school. And he kind of made that change without a whole lot of fanfare or other people knowing. Just the folks starting this fall are going to have to do it. And I think that matters. You know, representation matters, like having, you know, Black leadership, Black faculty, you know, our voices happen at a certain time. I've told a bunch of people that, man, I'm hopeful that Kamala Harris becomes our vice presidential nominee. But I'm also nervous because if she does, she won't be in the Senate anymore. And the United States Senate didn't start talking about issues of minority women's health until she got there, you know, which shows this isn't a partisan issue. This is a representational issue, you know. But I pray that from the perch of a higher seat, maybe she can make this issue even louder. So I thank you all for your time. You can reach out to me. I know my contact information was in the chat, jazz@jazzlewis.com. I know it can be intimidating sometimes to reach out to legislators about issues, but I promise I'm pretty approachable. You can contact me whenever, however you would deem fit. And if you have an idea of some policy that you have some expertise on and you know is a problem that we need to address, let me know. I would love to work with you and us pursue a campaign to address that together. So thank you all.
I know we're out of time, and so I will keep this under 30 seconds. So for my closing remarks, I wanted to reflect on some of the great work that come out of Howard University. I still love my Maryland people. Still love my Turks. But one of the psychologists there does a lot of work with going back to values of our African ancestors. So spirituality, communalism, and narratives. And he's actually in education. So he takes these principles and he say, well, how can we use these historical values of our African ancestors and integrate them in the schools to move the African-American students along. So anyway, he talks about different values, and three I think are relevant to what I hope to the messages that we talked about today. One is communalism. So love on each other, love on your neighbors, love on your family, love on each other, because this really is going to take a collective effort to begin to pick at the systemic and deep-rooted issues that we've talked about today. He also highlights spirituality. Even if you're not a spiritual person, I take that to mean to pour into yourself, make sure you're balanced, make sure you're filling yourself up. And then, you know, to dovetail the communalism value, he talks about people of the African diaspora being oral, really being narrative and talk to each other. We got to be open. We got to be honest. We have to, and, you know, that's the step in the right direction to begin to destigmatize some of the mental health issues that we talked about today. So I know we're out of time. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble, and thank you for inviting me to the panel.
Thank you so much to our panelists today.
Thank you, everybody, for your participation today. Thank you to our moderator, Adia Moore, Esquire. Thank you so much. Thank you to Delegate Jazz Lewis. Thank you to Dr. Amana Ali Carter. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate your expertise. We appreciate our audience for spending part of your afternoon with us today. Once again, their contact information is in the chat, and they both said that they are willing to have people reach out to them. Please take them up on that offer. For any questions that we did not get to, we do apologize. But I think this was a powerful and fruitful town hall. And I want to thank Chmaika for spearheading it. And we hope that you all will join us again for future University of Maryland Black alumni events. Thank you, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your Saturday and weekend. Take care.